The train pulled into Caldwell, Kansas on a Wednesday in April of 1882, carrying 37 passengers, 4 crates of dry goods, a shipment of barbed wire, and one woman who had traveled 800 miles to marry a man she had never met, only to discover upon her arrival that he had married someone else 3 weeks prior. Esther Hawthorne stepped off that train with a single leather traveling case, a small wooden brooch painted with blue morning glories that had belonged to her mother, and the particular kind of dignity that only women who have survived genuine humiliation tend to carry, quiet, upright, burning just beneath the surface like a coal that refuses to go entirely dark. She was 26 years old. She had dark auburn hair that she wore pinned beneath a modest gray bonnet, and green eyes that took in the Kansas dust, and the unpainted storefronts and the wide, windswept sky with the expression of a woman who has already made her calculations and found the situation manageable, if not precisely what she had hoped for. The letter she had received from one Gerald Whitmore of Caldwell had been thorough and reasonably well written. He had described himself as a cattleman of moderate means, with a proper house and honest intentions. He had asked for a woman of steady temperament who could keep a home and was not afraid of hard seasons. He had asked that she be of Christian faith, which she was, and that she have some experience in practical matters, which she did. Esther had answered that letter from a boarding house in Cincinnati, Ohio, where she had been working as a seamstress since her father's death 2 years prior, and where the wages were just sufficient to survive and nowhere near sufficient to build any kind of future. She had answered that letter, and a correspondence had followed, and then a formal proposal, and she had packed her things and purchased a train ticket, and told herself that this was a reasonable and sensible course of action taken by countless women before her, and that love was something that sometimes came after the arrangements rather than before, and that this was perfectly fine. And then she had stepped off the train into Caldwell, Kansas, and a young man named Tommy Briggs, who worked at the livery stable, had recognized her from Gerald Whitmore's description: auburn hair, gray bonnet, traveling alone, and had come to meet her with his hat in his hands and the deeply uncomfortable expression of a person delivering bad news. Gerald Whitmore, Tommy informed her, had gotten himself married to a widow named Carla Meacham in March. It had happened quickly. He had not written to Esther to inform her because, according to Tommy, who had clearly been pressed into this task against his preference, Gerald Whitmore was not a man who liked difficult conversations. Esther had stood on the wooden platform of the Caldwell depot and listened to this information with her leather case in her hand and the Kansas wind pushing at the brim of her bonnet, and she had thanked Tommy Briggs very politely and asked him if there was a decent boarding house in town. That was how she came to the territory wearing someone else's future. She took a room at Mrs. Clara Holt's boarding house on Kishom Street, which cost her 30 cents a night and included a morning meal and the considerable conversational output of Mrs. Holt herself, who was a widow of 52 with strong opinions about nearly everything and a genuinely warm nature beneath the opinions. Esther paid for 3 nights up front with the money she had carefully saved, and then she sat on the narrow bed in the narrow room and looked at the ceiling and allowed herself exactly 10 minutes of feeling the full weight of her situation before she stood up, straightened her dress, and went downstairs to ask Mrs. Holt if there was any work to be found in Caldwell. Caldwell in 1882 was a cattle town at the end of the Kishom Trail, which meant it was noisy and dusty, and populated with cowboys who had driven longhorns up from Texas and wanted whiskey and entertainment in roughly equal measure. It had a jail that the marshal kept busy, 3 saloons, a general store run by a man named Peterson who had excellent prices on flour and fair prices on everything else, 2 churches, a schoolhouse, a telegraph office, a hotel, a blacksmith, and a doctor who was also the dentist and who Esther suspected was better at one of those things than the other. It also had a small dry goods and tailoring operation attached to the back of Peterson's general store, which was being run into the ground by a man named Peterson Jr., who had his father's head for commerce and absolutely none of his father's head for commerce, and who had let the tailoring side of things lapse entirely since the woman who had been doing it had left Caldwell with her husband the previous autumn. Mrs. Holt told Esther all of this over supper that first evening, along with a considerable amount of additional information about the town's residents, their histories, and their personal failings, which Esther filed away without comment. The next morning she went to see Peterson Sr., and within 20 minutes she had negotiated herself a position doing alterations and basic tailoring in exchange for a wage of $4 a week plus a small portion of whatever she brought in from new work, which was a fair arrangement and better than the seamstress work in Cincinnati had paid per hour of effort. Peterson Sr. shook her hand with the satisfied expression of a man who had solved a problem he had not been expecting to solve before noon. That was Thursday. On Friday she began work. On Saturday she met Albert Bishop. He came into Peterson's general store on that Saturday morning, in the particular manner of a man who has been somewhere without adequate supplies for too long, and is now moving through a store with focused efficiency, his list clearly organized in his head, even if there was no paper in his hand. He was 31 years old, lean in the way that men who work outdoors tend to be lean, which is to say genuinely and functionally, with dark hair that needed cutting and a jaw that had not seen a razor in several days and brown eyes that were, Esther noticed from behind the curtain that separated the tailoring area from the store, paying close attention to everything around him in the particular way that people who spend a great deal of time alone tend to pay attention when they come into company. He was not a loud man. He did not swagger. He asked Peterson Sr. for 40 pounds of flour, 20 of cornmeal, salt pork, dried beans, coffee, a box of rifle cartridges, and a new axe handle, because his had split clean through 2 weeks ago and he had been making do with a hatchet, which he said he was tired of doing. His voice was level and unhurried, and he spoke to Peterson with the ease of a man who had done business in this store before and trusted the man behind the counter. Esther was hemming a pair of trousers for a cowboy who had come in that morning, a young man named Diego Reyes, who had explained with cheerful embarrassment that he had grown 4 inches since these trousers were made, and the situation had become professionally untenable. She was working quietly behind the curtain, and she was not, she told herself firmly, watching the man at the counter through the narrow gap in the curtain. She was, however, listening. Peterson Sr. said as he was tallying up the order, "I hear you had some trouble up on that North Creek last week." Albert Bishop said, "Nothing I couldn't handle." Peterson said, "Baxter men." There was a pause. "Couple of them came by and suggested I might be interested in selling. I suggested they might be interested in leaving." Peterson made a sound that was not quite a laugh. "You be careful, Bishop. Baxter is not a man who takes no for an answer easily." "I am aware," Albert said, and his voice was still level, but there was something in it now that had not been there before, something that Esther, who had learned to read the tone beneath people's words as a survival skill, identified as controlled concern. He was not afraid, but he was not unconcerned either. He was a man who understood his situation clearly. He paid for his supplies, loaded them into the wagon he had waiting outside, and left. Esther finished hemming Diego Reyes's trousers and said nothing about any of this, but she thought about the brown eyes and the level voice for the rest of that day in the way that thoughts sometimes arrive when you are not looking for them, and then refuse to leave. She did not see Albert Bishop again for 10 days. In those 10 days she established herself in Caldwell with the quiet thoroughness that was characteristic of her. She altered 3 more pairs of trousers, mended a dress for Mrs. Holt's neighbor, made a new shirt for the marshal who was named Eli Tucker and who was a decent man with a wife and 3 children, and began work on a proper dress for a young woman named Nora Finch who was to be married in June. The Finch dress was going to be her best work here so far, she could already tell, because Nora Finch had excellent taste and a clear vision of what she wanted, and was willing to pay properly for it. She also learned more about Caldwell. She learned that the town had been incorporated only a few years prior, and that it occupied a strange position between the wildness of the open cattle trail and the steady pressure of settlement and law. She learned that the ranchers in the surrounding territory had a complicated relationship with one another, some cooperative and some not, and that a man named Douglas Baxter held more land than anyone else in the county and had ambitions to hold more. She learned that Albert Bishop had a ranch 12 miles north of town on a piece of land he had claimed and worked for 4 years, that he was unmarried and kept to himself, and came into town once or twice a month for supplies, and that he was well regarded by the people who knew him, which was not everyone because he was, as Mrs. Holt put it with a certain philosophical resignation, not a man who makes himself easy to know. She did not ask about Albert Bishop specifically. She simply listened to Mrs. Holt's inexhaustible supply of information and filed things away. He came back into Peterson's on a Tuesday, 11 days after the Saturday she had first seen him, and this time he had a problem she could solve. He came to the tailoring curtain directly, which meant Peterson Sr. had sent him, and he knocked on the wooden frame of the curtain opening with his knuckles rather than calling out, which she noticed. When she said to come in, he ducked through the curtain and stood in the small tailoring space with his hat in his hand. She noticed that too, the hat coming off without being asked, and he looked at the work she had spread across the table and then at her, and she looked back at him. "Peterson says you do tailoring," he said. "I do," Esther said. He held out the jacket he had been carrying over his arm. It was a good quality dark wool jacket, the kind of thing a man wore to church or into town for business, and it had been let out at some point along its life and then, she could see from where she stood, had the lining torn out at the shoulder seam and the outer fabric beginning to separate from the internal structure at that same point. It was a repair job that required knowing what you were doing, not just what was immediately visible. "I have need to wear this at some point in the next couple of weeks," he said. "I would need it repaired properly. I do not know if that is possible." Esther crossed the small space and took the jacket from him without asking and turned it in her hands, examining the damage. She pulled back the lining at the shoulder and looked at the underlining, checked the seam allowance, pressed the fabric between her fingers to test the weight. "It is possible," she said. "The wool is still good quality. Someone repaired it before with the wrong weight of thread, and it caused stress on the seam. I would need to redo the shoulder construction properly, reset the lining, and reinforce the collar attachment, which is also beginning to go. 2 days if I start today." He looked at her with the same focused attention she had noticed in him before, the quality of a man who was genuinely listening and assessing rather than waiting for his turn to speak. "What will it cost?" he asked. She named a fair price. He agreed without negotiating, which she respected. Some men negotiated as a matter of course, as if it were owed to them regardless of whether the price was fair, and she had already learned to find it wearing. "I am Albert Bishop," he said. "I have a ranch north of town." "Esther Hawthorne," she said. "I have a sewing table in Peterson's back room." The corner of his mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was the precursor to one, and it changed the quality of his face in a way that was, she noted with the careful neutrality she was applying to all such observations regarding this man, quite remarkable. "I will be back Thursday," he said. He left. She stood for a moment with his jacket in her hands, and then she got to work. She had his jacket finished by Wednesday evening, which was earlier than promised, but she had found that working on it was satisfying in the way that genuinely good materials and a genuine problem always satisfied her, and she had been thorough. She had not merely repaired the shoulder. She had reconstructed it properly so that the jacket sat as it was meant to sit, with a clean line at the collar and a proper drape through the back. She had matched the thread precisely, and the lining lay flat and smooth against the wool in a way it clearly had not in some time. When he came Thursday morning and she handed it to him, he put it on before he looked at it, and when he had it on he stood still for a moment as if taking the measure of how it fit. Then he looked at himself in the small mirror she kept on the table, turning slightly to see the shoulder. "That is considerably better than it was," he said. "It is better than it has been in some time," Esther said. "Whoever did the previous repair did not understand the structure. They were patching rather than building." He looked at her reflection in the mirror rather than turning, and there was something in his expression that was both approving and curious, as if she had said something that resonated beyond the jacket. "That is a useful distinction," he said. She collected her fee, and he paid it, and then he stood for a moment in the small space without quite leaving, which she noticed because he was not a man who lingered pointlessly. "Mrs. Holt tells me you came from Ohio," he said. "Mrs. Holt tells everyone everything," Esther said, with a tone that was mild enough that he understood it was not a complaint, merely an acknowledgement of fact. "She does," he agreed. He was quiet for a moment. "I came from Missouri originally. I have been in Kansas 4 years." She looked at him. He had not offered that information in the way of small talk, she felt. He had offered it in the way of a man saying that he understood what it was to come from somewhere else and rebuild. "Do you find it suits you?" she asked. "The territory." He considered this with the seriousness he seemed to bring to everything. "I find that it is honest," he said finally. "What you put into it, it gives back. What you do not, it does not. I find that suits me, yes." He left shortly after, and Esther stood in the tailoring room for a while after the sound of his boots on the store's wooden floor had faded, and looked at the work spread out on her table and thought about what he had said. She had been in Caldwell 2 weeks. She had a job and a room and the beginning of a reputation for good work. She had arrived wearing the future that Gerald Whitmore had promised, and Gerald Whitmore had given to someone else, and she had been too busy in the practical business of survival to feel the full dimensions of that until now, standing in the quiet of the tailoring room in the afternoon light that came through the single high window, with the smell of wool and beeswax thread around her. She was not heartbroken over Gerald Whitmore, she realized. She had not loved him. She had not known him. She was something more complicated and less dramatic than heartbroken. She was a woman who had made a plan based on the best available information and had found the information faulty, and who was now in the process of making a new plan. She was not certain yet what the new plan looked like. Over the following weeks, Esther Hawthorne became a fixture in Caldwell in the quiet and efficient way that competent people sometimes do, not through any particular social effort, but through the simple mechanism of being genuinely good at something people needed. Word of her work spread the way practical word spreads in small towns, through honest recommendation rather than advertisement, and she found herself with more work than she had expected, enough that she was beginning to think about whether there might be a way to formalize the arrangement with Peterson Sr., perhaps with a slightly more prominent space and a proper sign. Albert Bishop came into town twice in May and once in early June, and each time he came by the tailoring space, not always with something to be repaired, but with something like the habit of a man whose feet have found a direction that satisfies them without him having entirely examined why. He brought her a piece of calico fabric on his second May visit that he had found in Peterson and thought she might be able to use for something, which was such an unexpected gesture that she stood looking at it for a moment before she thanked him, and he looked slightly embarrassed in the way of a man who has done something impulsive and is not certain of its reception. She told him the calico was very good quality and that she had been intending to buy some for a project she was working on, which was true, and the relief in his expression was something she found both endearing and slightly painful, in the way that things which are genuinely sweet sometimes are when they are also revealing something about a person's loneliness. They talked on those visits. Not extensively, not with the effusive quality of people performing sociability, but in the manner of two people who find the other's company genuinely useful for the mind. He told her about the ranch, about the particular challenges of the North Creek land, about the cattle he was running, and the plans he had for expanding the operation if the season was good. She told him about the projects she was working on, about the challenges of getting proper materials in the territory, about the small economics of running a tailoring business in a cattle town, where most of the clientele was more interested in durability than elegance. He listened to her with the same focused attention he brought to everything, and she found that she had begun to look forward to those visits in a way that she examined with the same careful honesty she brought to her work. The Douglas Baxter problem became a more visible problem in mid-June. Esther knew about Baxter from Mrs. Holt's conversations and from the general talk of the town, but she had not understood the extent of it until the morning that Albert Bishop came into Caldwell looking different than she had seen him before, not angry exactly, but carrying something that had pulled the ease out of him. He came to the tailoring room, and she saw it in him before he said a word. "Baxter has moved a fence line," he said, 30 yards into my north pasture. I have spoken to him about it, and he has told me that my surveying records are incorrect, which they are not. He laid a sheaf of papers on her work table, which she found both telling and touching, that his first instinct when troubled was to come here to this space to her. "These are my land records," he said. "The original claim filed in 1878 and the subsequent survey. I need to go to the land office in Wichita, and I need to have these in order." She looked at the papers. She had, as it happened, a neat and precise hand and a methodical mind, and she had helped her father with his business correspondence in Cincinnati before his death, and she understood legal documents better than most. "Sit down," she said. "Let me look at these." He sat, which told her something. He was not a man who followed direction easily, she had gathered, but he sat down without hesitation, and she spent an hour going through his land records with him, organizing the documents in the proper order, identifying the key pieces of evidence that established his boundary, and explaining in plain terms what would need to be presented at the land office. "You are good at this," he said at some point, watching her work. "My father was a merchant," she said. "Records and documentation were his business. I learned, and the sewing. My mother," she said simply, "she was a very fine seamstress. It was the most useful thing she left me when she died." There was a silence that was not uncomfortable. "When did you lose her?" he asked. "When I was 15, Esther said. "My father 6 years later. I have no siblings. It has been myself managing things for some time." He was quiet for a moment. "I lost my father when I was 17, he said. "My mother remarried and moved to St. Louis. My brother went with her. I went to Kansas." There was a great deal in those few sentences that she understood without it needing to be elaborated, about the particular shape of a certain kind of solitude, about the choices that look like geography but are really about something else entirely. "Did you ever regret it?" she asked. "Going to Kansas instead?" He looked at the papers in front of him for a moment. "Not once," he said, and the certainty in it was complete and unperformative. He went to Wichita the following week with his documents in order, and while he was gone, Esther found that the tailoring room was quieter than it ought to be for reasons that had nothing to do with the actual volume of work. She was in love with him. She recognized it the way you recognize a landscape you have seen in a painting before you have seen it in person. The reality of it is bigger than the image, but unmistakably the same thing. She was not certain what to do with this information, given that she had arrived in Caldwell to marry one man and had found him already married, and had been in this territory for approximately 2 months, and the situation was, she told herself firmly, not simple. She went back to work on Nora Finch's wedding dress, which was coming along beautifully. Albert returned from Wichita at the end of June with the land office's formal acknowledgement of his boundary records and a notice that Baxter's fence would need to be moved. Baxter moved it because he was a man who pushed where he could and retreated when the law was clearly against him, though Esther heard from Mrs. Holt that he was not happy about it and that the town generally expected he would find another angle. Albert came to Peterson's the day after he returned, and he came directly to the tailoring room, and when he ducked through the curtain there was a lightness in him that she had not seen before, a quality of relief that had opened something up in his face. "It is resolved," he said. "I am very glad," she said, and meant it fully. He looked at her for a moment. "I want to thank you," he said, "properly. The way you organized those documents, the order you put them in, the way you explained what was needed. I am not certain I would have known how to present the case as clearly without that." "You would have managed," Esther said. "Perhaps," he said, "but I would rather not have had to." He asked her then, with the careful directness of a man who does not do things casually, whether she would allow him to take her to supper at the hotel dining room that evening if she was not otherwise engaged. She said yes. She said it calmly and without excessive ceremony. And then after he left, she stood very still for a moment in the tailoring room with her hands flat on the worktable and permitted herself to feel the particular quality of that yes for a few seconds before returning to Nora Finch's wedding dress with renewed attention to detail. The hotel dining room in Caldwell in the summer of 1882 was not a grand establishment. It had 6 tables with white cloths that were white in aspiration, if not always entirely in fact, a menu of 3 or 4 choices that depended on what had come in on the supply wagon, and a piano that the proprietress's nephew played on Friday and Saturday evenings with genuine enthusiasm and mixed results. On a Wednesday evening it was quiet and the food was simple and good, and Esther sat across from Albert Bishop in the lamplight, and they talked for 2 hours in the way that they had been building toward since the first morning he had handed her his jacket. She told him about Cincinnati, about the boarding house where she had lived for 2 years after her father's death, about the work that was steady but narrow, about the particular constriction of a life that was safe but not expansive. She told him about the correspondence with Gerald Whitmore, and she told it plainly, without making herself smaller than she was but also without the performance of suffering. It was a choice she had made based on the information available. The information had been false, and she had adapted. That was the truth of it. Albert listened to this with a stillness that she had come to understand was not coldness, but its opposite, genuine attention. "You are not sorry to be here," he said. "I mean, despite all of it." "No," she said, and the surprise in her own voice was genuine. "I am not. I think I might be more myself here than I was in Ohio." She paused. "That sounds strange." "It sounds true," he said. He told her about the ranch, about what it had taken to build it from the raw claim in 1878, about the first winter that had been brutal, and the second that had been worse, and the third that had turned, finally, toward something like abundance. He spoke about the land with a kind of restrained passion that she recognized as the way people speak about the things that are most central to them, not extravagantly, because extravagance would not do justice to the reality, but with a precision of language that conveyed the depth of the feeling. He walked her back to Mrs. Holt's boarding house afterward, and at the door he held his hat in his hand and told her that he had enjoyed the evening very much. She told him she had as well. There was a moment that held something between them, a moment that was not awkward but was aware of itself. And then he said good night and she went inside, and she sat on the narrow bed in the narrow room and looked at the ceiling with an expression that Mrs. Holt, who had excellent instincts about these things, would have recognized immediately. July brought the full heat of a Kansas summer, which was not a subtle season. The cattle drives that moved through Caldwell in the summer created a particular kind of noise and dust and commerce, and the town was busier than it had been in the spring. Esther found her work expanding to include repair jobs for cowboys passing through, simple and fast work that added up to a reasonable sum, and she was saving money with the steady deliberateness of a woman who has been without financial security long enough to know its value. Albert came to town more frequently in July, and the visits to the tailoring room were longer, and the conversations moved in the way conversations do when 2 people who have been careful with each other begin to be less careful. They argued once pleasantly, about the relative merits of two different approaches to a land drainage problem he was considering for the North Pasture, she having read something relevant in a farming journal that Peterson Sr. kept in the store, and he having practical experience that she lacked. And they found a middle position that was genuinely better than either starting point. And both of them noticed this about themselves, that they were better thinking together than separately, without saying so directly. He kissed her for the first time at the end of July. It was not a dramatic circumstance. They had been walking together in the early evening, a walk that had become something of a habit on the evenings when he was in town, along the edge of town to the point where the storefronts gave way to open prairie, and the sky was enormous, and the light turned everything a color that had no proper name. She had said something, she could not afterward recall precisely what, and he had stopped walking and looked at her with an expression that was entirely unguarded, and then he had said quietly, "Esther, I think I must tell you something." She looked at him. "Then tell me." "I think about you," he said, "considerably more than is perhaps appropriate given how short a time we have known each other. And I want to be honest with you about that, because I respect you too much to pretend otherwise." She held his gaze with her own. "Albert," she said, "how long do you believe is required before such feelings become appropriate?" He looked at her for a moment, and then something shifted in his face, and he reached out and tucked a loose strand of her hair back from her cheek with a touch that was so careful and so deliberate that it was more significant than any grand gesture could have been. And then he kissed her gently at the edge of the open Kansas prairie with the evening sky behind them, and she kissed him back. They stood afterward in the warm evening air, and he kept her hand and she did not take it back, and they were quiet together for a while in the particular silence of two people who have just confirmed something that had been building for a long time. "I should tell you something also," Esther said. "Tell me," he said. "I did not come here expecting to feel anything like this," she said. "I came here with someone else's plan for my life, and I want you to know that what I feel is not gratitude for rescue or the convenience of proximity. It is specific to you." He was quiet for a moment, and his grip on her hand was steady and sure. "I know," he said. "I think I know that." She believed that he did. August arrived, and with it a complication. Douglas Baxter, true to the general expectation that he would find another angle, had apparently decided that if he could not push Albert Bishop off his land legally, he might try socially. He began, through channels that were not quite direct enough to be actionable, spreading a story that Albert's land records were fraudulent, that the original claim had been filed using a dead man's name, which was entirely false, and which Albert could disprove with documentation, but which was doing a certain amount of damage in the way that lies do when they arrive first and truth has to chase them. Esther heard this from Mrs. Holt, who was furious about it in the protective and indignant way of a woman who had decided Albert Bishop was a good man and was not about to sit quietly while his reputation was poisoned. When Albert came to town the following Saturday, he was not aware of the full extent of it, and she told him. He listened with that level stillness of his, and she watched his jaw set, and she watched him take the anger in and organize it into something controlled and directed. "The claim is completely documented," he said. "The man who filed it is me, and I am not dead." "Then you need to make that clear publicly," Esther said. "Not just at the land office, but here in town where the story is circulating." He looked at her. "How?" "You let people see the documents," she said. "You talk to Tucker. You ask the marshal to publicly confirm the record. You make Baxter's version of events look as flimsy as it is, not by attacking him directly, but by making the truth so obvious and available that the lie has nowhere to stand." He was quiet for a moment. "You think clearly under pressure," he said. "I have had to," she said. He went to see Marshal Tucker that afternoon, and Tucker, who had his own reasons for wanting Douglas Baxter to be aware that certain behaviors had consequences, was willing to make a quiet and effective statement to the town's prominent citizens about the validity of Albert Bishop's claim. The story lost its traction within a week. Baxter did not openly retreat, but he ceased to advance. On the Sunday after the situation had resolved, Albert came to the boarding house in the morning, which was unusual, and asked Mrs. Holt, with an expression of careful composure that Mrs. Holt would describe to her neighbor later as sweet in the most dignified possible way, whether Esther might be available to take a drive with him that afternoon. Esther came downstairs and saw him standing in Mrs. Holt's front room with his good jacket on, the one she had repaired in that first week, and she understood that this was not an ordinary visit. They drove out to the ranch. She had heard it described and had formed some picture of it, but the reality of it was larger and more beautiful than the picture. The house was not large, a solid two-room structure with a good stone foundation, and a proper chimney, and a porch that faced west so that the evening light came full onto it, and the land around it rolled in long grass to the tree line of the creek, and the sky above it was the particular deep blue of a Kansas August afternoon that made every other blue seem approximate. He showed her around with a quietness that she recognized as nervousness, which was so unusual in him that it moved her. He showed her the house, which was clean and simple and organized in the manner of a man who had been alone for a long time, but had not given up on the idea that a home could be a proper home. He showed her the barn and the corrals, the cattle that were moving in the north pasture, the place along the creek where the cottonwood trees made shade in the afternoon. He was telling her something, she understood, not with words but with the showing of it, and she received what he was telling her with the full seriousness it deserved. They sat on the porch in the late afternoon, and he brought out coffee that was stronger than what she was used to but not unpleasant, and they sat in a silence that was full and warm and entirely comfortable. "It is a very fine piece of land," she said. "It is," he agreed. "It is the best thing I have built." A pause. "So far." She looked at him. The afternoon light was on his face, and he was looking at her with an expression that was open and decided and serious. "Esther," he said. He stopped. He had the look of a man who has rehearsed something and found at the moment of delivery that the rehearsal is inadequate. "I am not a man who is good at oratory. I think you know that. I want to say something to you plainly and properly." "Then say it plainly," she said. "I love you," he said. "I have been fairly certain of it for some time and completely certain of it for the last several weeks. I am not asking you anything today unless you want me to ask. I only want you to know it because I think you deserve to know it, and because I find I cannot continue in this situation of knowing it without your knowing it also." She set down her coffee cup on the porch railing and turned to face him fully. She looked at him for a long moment, at the serious, honest face and the brown eyes that were looking back at her with an intensity of attention that she had come to understand was his version of vulnerability. "Albert," she said, "I love you as well. I have been certain of it since July, if you want precision." The relief and joy in his face were extraordinary to see, because he was a man who did not show things easily, and what he showed was therefore always genuine. And what she saw in that moment was a happiness so real and unguarded that it made her chest ache with the beauty of it. He reached over and took her hand. She turned her hand over and held his. They sat on the porch of the house on the North Creek land, and the sun moved toward the horizon, and the Kansas sky turned through gold and rose and violet above the long grass, and they talked until the stars came out, about the past and the future and all the specific details of a life that might be built deliberately rather than stumbled into. On the drive back to Caldwell in the dark, with the stars enormous overhead and the horses moving at an easy pace along the road, he asked her to marry him. He asked it simply and directly, as he did everything, and he said that he did not want her to feel that she was exchanging one planned future for another man's plan. He said that he was asking her to build something with him, not to inhabit something he had already built, and that whatever they made would be made together. She said yes. She said yes and meant it entirely and without reservation, which was, she reflected, a considerably different quality of yes than the one she had written in her letter to Gerald Whitmore, and the difference was everything. They were married in September. The wedding was not elaborate, because neither of them was an elaborate person, but it was beautiful in the way that simple things done with complete intention are beautiful. Mrs. Holt was practically radiant with satisfaction. Nora Finch, whose own wedding dress had been completed beautifully and who had married her husband in June, came with her husband and threw dried flower petals. Marshall Tucker stood with Albert as the nearest thing he had to a witness of long standing, and Peterson Sr. and his wife sat in the front row of the church, and Peterson Sr. had the expression of a man whose small act of practical problem-solving, hiring a seamstress, had turned out to be considerably consequential. The minister married them on a Saturday afternoon in early September, with the church windows open and a warm wind coming through. And when he said the words and Albert took her hand and made his promises in that level, unhurried voice, Esther felt the last of the journey from Cincinnati, the long arc of the trip and the false beginning and the months of patient rebuilding, resolve into the present moment with a finality and a rightness that was almost physical. After the ceremony, when the small gathering had moved to Mrs. Holt's house for celebration and her excellent cooking, Albert stood next to Esther and kept her hand, and they moved through the afternoon together as a unit, which was new and also felt entirely natural, as if the configuration had always been available and they had simply needed to arrive at it. Mrs. Holt, who cried throughout the ceremony and then denied doing so immediately after, pressed Esther's hands and said, with an earnestness that cut through all her usual cheerful commentary, "You are a fine woman, Esther Bishop, and he is a very good man, and I am so glad you came to us." Esther Bishop. She turned the name over in her mind on that first evening of it, not the name of a man who had failed to meet her at the station, but the name she had built herself into through her own choices in a territory that asked exactly what Albert had told her it asked. What you put in, it gives back. They went to the ranch that evening, the two of them, and it was no longer his house but their house, and this distinction mattered in a way that was quiet and enormous. The autumn of 1882 was a season of settlement, in every sense of the word. Esther continued her tailoring work in town, because the income was sensible, and because she genuinely loved the work, and she and Albert worked out the logistics of this with the practical cooperation that characterized the way they approached all things. She would be in Caldwell 3 days a week, and she would stay at the boarding house on those nights, and he would come for her on the other days, and on Sundays they were always at the ranch. She began to transform the house in small ways that were large in their cumulative effect. She put up curtains in the front room, a fabric she had made from a deep blue cotton that matched the evening sky outside the west-facing window. She organized the kitchen with the efficiency of a woman who understood that good organization was a form of respect for the work done there. She planted a small kitchen garden on the south side of the house, late in the season, but enough to tell her what the soil would do in spring. Albert watched these transformations with an expression that he probably did not know was as visible as it was, a quiet ongoing amazement, as if he had expected to have a life of a certain size and was finding, incrementally, that it was considerably larger. They talked every evening. Not performatively, not filling silence because silence frightened them, but with the ease of two people who had discovered that each other's minds were genuinely interesting to them. They talked about the ranch's winter preparations, about the cattle market, about a book she had ordered from a bookseller in Wichita. Caldwell had no bookshop, about the news that came through on the telegraph, about the small stories of the town. She told him once, in early October, lying awake in the dark with the wind picking up outside and his warm weight beside her in the bed, that she had been thinking about the morning she had stepped off the train in April. "I was so furious," she said, "for about 10 minutes, and then I was just very deliberate. I needed to get on with it." "I am glad you did," he said. I am glad of the whole thing, she said, even the terrible parts, because if Gerald Whitmore had been a man of his word, I would be living his life right now instead of mine. He was quiet for a moment. Is this yours? He asked. Truly, she thought about it. About the tailoring room and the work that satisfied her, and the house on the North Creek land, and the man beside her in the dark. More than anything has ever been mine, she said. He put his arm around her and pulled her close, and she settled against him. And outside the Kansas wind moved through the long grass with the sound of something vast and unhurried. Winter came and was hard, as winter in Kansas always was, but it was not the grinding solitary endurance that Albert had described from his first years on the land. It was a different kind of hard, shared, and that difference was everything. When the cold came down in January and the cattle needed tending in conditions that were painful, she was there with coffee and with practical sense, and with a warmth that he came back to at the end of the brutal cold hours, in the way that you return to something you have come to depend on. When she was worried about work in the slow winter months and was running calculations in her head at the kitchen table, he sat with her and worked through the numbers with the same methodical patience he brought to problems of land and livestock. Douglas Baxter made one more attempt in the winter, a more direct attempt, sending 2 of his men to the north boundary of Albert's land on a January night, with the apparent intention of damaging the fence line badly enough to claim a boundary dispute. Albert found them there in the dark, coming back from a late check on the cattle, and there was a tense exchange that he described to Esther the next morning as having resolved without violence, mainly because the 2 men, faced with Albert standing in the snow with a rifle and a composure that suggested he knew exactly what he was doing, had decided their employer's fence dispute was not worth the trouble it would cost. Baxter received a formal visit from Marshal Tucker the following week. He gave no more trouble after that. Men like Baxter understood power and consequence, and the consistent, documented, legally grounded resistance of Albert Bishop had made clear that there was nothing easy to be gotten here. By spring, the Baxter problem was settled. Not resolved in any dramatic sense, but settled, the way most things in the territory settled, into a kind of equilibrium where both parties understood the limits and respected them without warmth. The spring of 1883 was magnificent. The ranch came alive in a way that even Albert, who knew the land well, seemed to find extraordinary that year, as if the winter had compressed something and the April warmth released it all at once. The grass came in thick and green, and the cattle were in good condition, and the kitchen garden that Esther had prepared through the last weeks of March began to show its first growth with a promptness that she found personally satisfying. She told Albert she was expecting their first child on a morning in May, standing in the kitchen with the early light coming through the blue curtains and a cup of coffee going cold in her hand because she kept forgetting to drink it. He stood very still for a moment, and then he set down what he was holding and crossed the kitchen and took her face in his hands and looked at her with an expression that had no adequate description in any language, and then he kissed her forehead and held her against him with a gentleness and a certainty that made her close her eyes. "Are you well?" he asked quietly. "Completely well," she said. "Very well, in fact." "Good," he said. He held her a moment longer. "Good." The pregnancy proceeded without serious difficulty, because Esther was a healthy woman and a practical one, and she continued her tailoring work through most of it, adjusting her schedule sensibly as the months advanced. The women of Caldwell were attentive and generous in the way of women in communities who understand that the distance to a doctor is considerable, and that mutual support is therefore not sentiment but necessity. And she received more practical knowledge and more genuinely useful advice from Mrs. Holt, and from the wives of the ranching families she had come to know than she could have expected. Albert was, through the pregnancy, attentive in a way that was characteristic of him, not hovering or anxious in ways that would have irritated her, but present, consistently and reliably present, in the way of a man who has decided that this is where his attention belongs and who acts accordingly. She made a small garment for the coming baby in August, stitching it in the evenings on the ranch porch with the last of the summer light. And Albert sat with her those evenings and watched the light change and said very little, and she said very little, and the silence between them was full of the future arriving. Their son was born in late October of 1883, during the first week of the autumn's cold, a fine and loud and healthy boy whom they named Samuel, for Albert's father, and William, for hers. Samuel William Bishop arrived in the world in the bedroom of the house on the North Creek land, attended by the town's doctor and by Mrs. Holt, who had come out 3 days before in anticipation, and who was, as it turned out, considerably more useful in the actual event than the doctor, who was better at being a dentist. Albert held his son for the first time in the early morning, while Esther slept the deep sleep of the thoroughly exhausted, and she woke briefly at some point to the image of him sitting in the chair beside the bed with the baby in his arms, and his head bent over the small face with an expression of complete, undefended wonder. And she looked at that image for a moment before she let herself back into sleep, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever seen. Samuel grew through the winter and into the spring of 1884 with the energetic determination of a child who has a great deal to accomplish and is not inclined to waste time. He had his father's brown eyes and what appeared to be a temper that was somewhat more expressive than either parent's, which Esther suspected was a gift from some earlier generation that had bypassed them entirely. The ranch grew as well. Albert had been careful and methodical in its building, and by 1884 it was a properly established operation, with enough cattle to be economically solid and enough land management to be sustainable, and his reputation in the territory as a man who ran things well and dealt fairly was the kind of reputation that built itself through years of consistent behavior rather than advertisement. Esther's tailoring business had outgrown Peterson's back room by the spring of 1884, and she and Albert discussed this with the practicality that they brought to everything, and she rented a small proper space on Kisham Street, 3 doors down from Mrs. Holt's boarding house, with a real window that faced the street and a sign that she had painted herself in neat letters, Esther Bishop, Tailoring and Fine Sewing. It was a small establishment, but it was entirely hers, built from her own skill and reputation, and the morning she opened it she stood on the sidewalk for a moment and looked at the sign and felt something that was not pride exactly, but was the particular satisfaction of a person who has built exactly what they meant to build. Albert came to town that day specifically to see the sign, which was the kind of gesture that she had come to understand was his version of declaration. He stood on the sidewalk and looked at it and said, "That is a very fine sign." "Thank you," she said. "I painted it myself." He looked at her with that expression she had come to know as his happiness, the one that was visible more in the eyes than anywhere else. "I know," he said. Little Samuel was 18 months old and walking with the absolute confidence of a person who has never yet fallen, which meant he was falling constantly and minding it not at all. And the town of Caldwell received him with the collective warmth that small towns sometimes reserve for children of people they have watched build themselves into the place. Mrs. Holt was his unofficial second grandmother in all but title, and Peterson Sr. kept a small supply of stick candy behind the counter that was officially for paying customers and in practice largely for Samuel Bishop. In the summer of 1884, Nora Finch, now Nora Pemberton, came to the shop to ask Esther if she might make a christening gown for her first child, expected in the autumn. They had been friendly since the wedding dress, in the easy way of 2 women near in age who respected each other, and sitting in the shop that afternoon with the summer light coming through the street window, they talked with the kind of openness that comes from shared experience. Nora said at some point, "Do you ever think about what you came here for? I mean the first time." "Gerald Whitmore," Esther said without any particular weight. "Does it seem strange now?" Esther thought about it honestly. It seems like a very long time ago, she said, and it seems like the beginning of something rather than a mistake, which I know is perhaps a generous interpretation. I think it is a true one, Nora said. Esther thought about what she might have been, had Gerald Whitmore been a man of his word. She thought about a different ranch, a different house, a different set of circumstances built around a man she would never have chosen, and who had not, as it turned out, chosen her either. She thought about Samuel sleeping in his crib on the North Creek land, and about Albert coming in from the fields in the evening, with the particular expression he wore when he was thinking about something he wanted to tell her, and about the blue curtains in the front room and the morning glories she had planted along the porch railing that had come in beautifully that spring. She thought about all of it, and what she felt was something that had no word for it in English or any other language she knew, a fullness, a completed circuit, the sense of a life that was genuinely and entirely her own. The years that followed in that territory were years of growth and change in the way that the 1880s were in the whole of the West, the steady arrival of settlement and law, and the long conversation between the wild and the tamed, between freedom and structure, between the people who had been there and the people who came. The Kishom Trail began its long decline as the railroads expanded and the cattle routes changed, and Caldwell adapted, as towns do, finding new purposes and new economies to replace the old ones. Through all of it, the ranch on the North Creek land remained what it had always been, a place of deliberate building, of careful stewardship, of a family that knew what it was and was not confused about it. Samuel had a sister in 1886, a girl they named Clara for the woman who had given Esther her first room in Caldwell, and who arrived with her father's quiet attention and her mother's green eyes, and an additional quality that seemed to belong entirely to herself, an absolute certainty about her own preferences that was visible from approximately the third week of her life, and showed no sign of diminishing. Albert watched his daughter with the same wonder he had brought to his son, which Esther had not doubted but was glad to see confirmed. He was not a man who differentiated between his children in his devotion to them, which was the most important thing about him as a father, and Samuel and Clara grew up knowing themselves equally valued and equally expected to be capable. The ranch expanded through the late 1880s, not dramatically but steadily, acquiring the adjacent parcel to the east when old Thompson retired and sold in 1887, and building a proper bunkhouse for the two hands Albert had taken on, men he had chosen with the same methodical care he brought to all his decisions. Hector Vasquez, who had been a trail cook, and turned out to have a remarkable talent for working with horses, and a man named James Pryor who was quiet and thorough and who had, Albert told Esther after the first month, exactly the sort of mind I want looking at a problem I haven't seen yet. Esther's shop grew as well. She took on a young woman from Wichita in 1887, a girl named Lucy Marsh who had real skill and a good eye, and who Esther trained with the same careful attention to the underlying structure of the craft that her mother had used to train her. Lucy was quick and willing and genuinely talented, and there was a satisfaction in teaching that Esther had not expected but found to be real and considerable, the same satisfaction she imagined a good architect must feel watching something built to proper design. Mrs. Holt died in the spring of 1888, peacefully, in her own home, which was the way she would have wanted it. She left the boarding house to a niece who came from Missouri and continued to run it with a competence that would have satisfied its previous proprietress, if not quite her conversational output. Esther stood at the graveside and wept without any concern about who saw it, because she had loved that woman honestly and grief deserved honesty. Albert stood beside her with his hand around hers, and afterward he said nothing for a long time, only walked with her, and the silence was the right kind of silence, full of the understanding that some losses were simple and real and required no interpretation. That autumn, With the children in school, Esther sat on the porch of the ranch house one evening in the October light and looked at the land around her and thought about everything she knew about how she had come to be here. She had come to the territory wearing someone else's future, carrying the shape of a life designed by a man who had not had the decency to tell her he had changed his plans. She had arrived without backing and without welcome, with a leather traveling case and a mother's brooch, and the kind of stubborn competence that she had spent her whole life developing out of necessity. And then the territory had given her back something she had not brought with her. It had given her Albert Bishop, who had seen her clearly from the first, who had offered her not a plan or a position or a rescue but a partnership, a piece of land and a life that would require everything she had and return everything it owed. She heard the door open behind her, and she heard his step on the porch boards, and then he was beside her in the other chair, with a cup of coffee for her that was exactly the right temperature because he had been making her coffee for 6 years, and he knew precisely when to bring it out. She took the cup and he settled in beside her, and Samuel's voice was audible from inside the house, arguing with Clara about something with the passionate conviction of a 9-year-old, and Clara was responding with the cool authority of a 7-year-old who considers herself entirely in the right, and the October light was gold and amber on the long grass, and the cottonwood trees along the creek were turning. "What are you thinking?" Albert asked. She looked at him. He was 39 now, and the years of the territory were in his face, not harshly but honestly, the lines of a man who had looked into weather and into work and into life without flinching, and his eyes were the same brown they had always been, steady and intelligent and entirely present. "I am thinking," Esther said, "that I am very glad Gerald Whitmore was a coward." He smiled at that, the full smile that she had been collecting for 6 years, every one of them significant because of how rarely they came and therefore how completely genuine they always were. "So am I," he said. She leaned her head slightly toward him, and he shifted his arm, and she settled into the warmth of him. And they watched the evening come down over the North Creek land. Their land, built from their combined effort and their particular combination of strengths, hers and his, practical and enduring and beautiful in the way that things built with genuine intention always end up beautiful. Inside, Samuel and Clara had apparently resolved their dispute, because the argument had given way to laughter, and the sound of it came through the open window with the warm air and the smell of the supper that Esther had left on the stove. It was, she thought, exactly the life she would have chosen. Not the one she had been heading toward in April of 1882, not anyone else's design, but the one that had grown from her own choices and her own character, and one good man who had offered her not a destination but a direction, not a plan but a possibility, and trusted her to make it into something real. She had made it into something real. In the years that came after, when the territory became more settled, and the wildness of the Kishom Trail became something people told stories about rather than lived through, the ranch on the North Creek land remained what it had always been, a working place and a home, built on the principle that the effort you gave was the life you got. Samuel grew into a young man who had his father's steadiness and his mother's precision of mind, and by the time he was 15, he was a genuine working partner on the ranch in ways that went beyond chores, thinking about the land with the same long view his father brought to it. Clara, at 13, had already decided she was going to be a teacher, which she announced at the supper table one evening with the finality of someone who has thought the matter through and considers it settled, and both her parents looked at each other across the table with the expression of parents who recognize their child's absolute rightness about themselves. Esther was expecting their third child in the spring of 1891, a development that had surprised them both and then delighted them in the way that unexpected gifts do. And she continued to work at the shop through the winter with the practical sensibility that had always characterized her approach to her own body's capacities. She thought sometimes about the woman she had been on that train platform in April of 1882, leather case in hand, the whole shape of a borrowed future about to dissolve in the Kansas dust. She thought about how frightened that woman had been beneath the composure, how determined, how unwilling to let the fear show, because showing it would not have helped anything. She would have told that woman that it was going to be all right. She would have told her more than that it was going to be considerably more than all right, that the thing that looked like the destruction of the plan was actually the plan beginning in earnest. But she thought perhaps that woman had known, somewhere beneath the fear and the determination, that she was capable of making something from whatever she arrived at. That was the thing no one had taken from her, not her father's death or her mother's earlier departure or Gerald Whitmore's spectacular failure of character. She had arrived with her own capacities intact, and that had been sufficient. Albert had not rescued her. She wanted to be clear about that, in the privacy of her own understanding. He had offered her something real, and she had recognized it and accepted it and built it into something that belonged to both of them. That was not rescue. That was something considerably better. Their third child, another boy, arrived in April of 1891, 9 years nearly to the month after Esther had stepped off the train in Caldwell. They named him Thomas, a name neither of them had strong reason for except that when they held him and looked at him, they both said it at the same moment and looked at each other, and that was that. Thomas Henry Bishop was a quiet baby, and then a thoughtful toddler, and then, as he grew, a child with a specific and observable gift for drawing, filling the margins of every piece of paper he could find with careful depictions of the land around the ranch, the horses and the cattle, and the long sweep of the creek trees, with a precision that made Esther think of her mother's work in fabric, the same attention to line and structure, the same instinct for the underlying form of things. She kept his drawings with the same care she kept the letters from her father and her mother's brooch, in the small cedar box she had acquired in Caldwell in that first year, the box that held the things that were most genuinely hers. The ranch held through the dry years of the early 1890s that were hard on many operations in the territory, because Albert had managed his water resources with the deliberate foresight of a man who understood that the land was generous but not infinitely patient, and the creek management they had improved together in those early years of conversation and practical planning served them when others found themselves short. They lost some cattle, as everyone did, but they did not lose the operation itself, and when the rains returned in 1893 and the grass came back thick and green, the Bishop Ranch was in better condition than most. Esther hired a second seamstress in 1892, a woman named Dolores Arsenault, whose people had been in the territory for generations, who brought skills with embroidery and decorative work that complemented the shop's offerings and expanded them into things Esther had not been doing before. They worked well together, and the friendship that developed between them was the kind built on mutual respect for each other's competence, which was, Esther had found, the most solid foundation for any friendship. When Samuel turned 17 in the spring of 1893, he said at supper one evening that he wanted to study agriculture, that there was a college program in Manhattan, Kansas, that taught scientific approaches to land management, and that he thought if he spent 2 years there, he would bring back things that would help the ranch for the next 30 years. He laid out his argument with the careful logic of someone who had thought it through, and his parents listened to the full argument before Albert said, simply, "When do you need to go?" The relief on Samuel's face was something Esther recognized, the particular relief of a child who feared their ambition might be seen as desertion, finding that it was seen instead as exactly what it was, the natural extension of everything they had been raised toward. She cried a little when they put him on the train to Manhattan, and she did not pretend otherwise, and Albert stood beside her on the platform and kept her hand until the train was out of sight. "He will be excellent," Albert said. "I know," she said. "I am not worried about him. I am only going to miss him." "Yes," he said. "So am I." They drove back to the ranch in the warm September morning, and Clara was waiting on the porch steps with Thomas beside her, 7 years old and holding one of his drawings to show his mother. And Esther stepped down from the wagon and took the drawing and admired it honestly, because it was genuinely admirable. A careful rendering of the cottonwood trees along the creek, and the way the light came through them. And if you looked at it, you could feel the particular quality of that light. Albert came and looked over her shoulder and said, "That is better than the one last week." Thomas looked at his father with enormous satisfaction. "I know," he said. The evening of that day, with Clara and Thomas inside and the September night coming on warm and starry, Esther and Albert sat on the porch in the old chairs that had been replaced once since the early days but occupied the same spots, and she leaned into him in the way she had been leaning into him for over a decade, and the land around them was quiet and full and entirely theirs. "Samuel will come back," she said. "Changed and better and full of things we do not know yet." "He will," Albert agreed. "And Clara will teach," Esther said. "And Thomas will make things with his hands and his eyes." "And we will be here," Albert said, "to see all of it." She tilted her head to look at him. "Are you content?" she asked. "Truly." He looked at her, and what was in his face was the full answer to the question, the one that had been building for 12 years now, every day of work and every evening of conversation and every night in the particular quiet of this house that had always been more than a house because of what they had made of it together. "I came here," he said, "from Missouri with a claim and a plan and nothing else, and I built something that was worth building." He held her gaze. "And then you came, wearing someone else's plan, and I offered you mine. And what we made together is something I could never have built alone, something better than any plan I had." He was quiet for a moment. "Content is a very small word for what I am." She smiled at him. "Then use a larger one." He thought about it in the serious way he thought about things, and then he said, "Home, I am home." He paused. "Entirely." She leaned her head against his shoulder, and the Kansas stars were enormous above the North Creek land, and the long grass moved in the night wind, and the house behind them held their children and their history and the accumulated evidence of a life built with both hands and with full intention, and it was precisely and entirely enough, and more. She had come to the territory wearing someone else's future. He had offered her one of her own. And what she had made of it, what they had made of it together in the years between that April morning on the train platform and this September night on the ranch porch under the stars, was the truest and most complete answer to every question she had ever had about what a life ought to be. The territory was changing around them, as territories do, growing into something more tame and more legal and more ordinary with each passing year, and the particular wildness that had shaped them both was becoming something you read about in newspapers and in the stories old men told in front of general stores. But the land itself did not change. The creek ran where it had always run, and the cottonwood trees grew where they had always grown, and the grass moved in the wind with the sound of something vast and patient and entirely indifferent to the small human lives that played out above it, except that the land knew, in the way that only worked land knows, the difference between those who treated it as something to be taken from and those who understood it as something to be kept and cared for and passed forward. Albert Bishop had always known that difference. Esther Bishop had come to know it. And the ranch on the North Creek land, that particular piece of Kansas earth, held them and was held by them year after year, through all the seasons that came and went and came again, solid and particular and real, exactly as it had promised to be from the beginning. And that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.